Macclesfield, a quaint market town situated in the northwest of England.
It's a very nice town to live in. You've got some very, very expensive areas where the property prices are sky high.
An area where traditional values meet modern living and where a certain quality of life is assured.
It's certainly considered one of the better areas of Cheshire.
In 1985, 56-year-old Joan Beddison moved into the suburb of Macclesfield known as Broken Cross.
I personally think that her whole life really revolved around her home. She was absolutely fastidious about the home.
But the shy and retiring church-going spinster could never have imagined that one day she would become the target of a cruel and deceptive predator.
Nobody knew Joan better than I, and how she come to be hoodwinked in this way, I to this day cannot understand, I cannot grasp that.
As Joan prepared for bed late on the evening of Thursday, the 14th of November 2002, she received a telephone call. And although only 2 people knew what had been said, that conversation would change the lives of all involved forever. Following the death of her parents when she was in her teens, Joan Beddison was brought up by her Uncle Norman and Aunt Kath in Stockport, Cheshire.
They didn't have any children of their own, and I think they looked upon Joan as a daughter that they'd never had. And she was very, very happy living with them.
They doted upon her, they looked after her, and Joan reciprocated that love. She did everything for them. Nothing was too much trouble for her.
But when Aunt Kath passed away, Joan and her Uncle Norman were left to look after each other.
They developed a very close relationship. She looked after Uncle Norman, and I think in many ways she looked upon him as the father that she hadn't had for so many years.
Their relationship was so strong that Joan never married or started a family of her own.
As much as I think she would have liked to have met someone to marry, I don't quite think that anybody ever matched up to Uncle Norman.
But when Norman passed away in 1984, Joan was alone again.
Now that Norman had passed away, we rallied round her, and then she dropped the bombshell. She was moving to Macclesfield.
When Uncle Norman left his estate to Joan, and with that money she then went on to purchase a bungalow in Macclesfield. Uncle Norman had always wanted to live there, and even though he died, I think she wanted to carry out his wishes. And I think that was a tribute, really. She did that, I think, in memory of her uncle.
And she kept the house immaculate, just how Uncle Norman would have liked it.
It was almost like walking back into the original home that they had in Lower Bredbury. It was the same furniture, and the decor was exactly the same.
I think the fact that she liked the home so immaculate was that when she'd lived with Uncle Norman, he was actually quite a stickler. And even though he died, I think she wanted to carry out his wishes. It was a way of fulfilling his dream and her dream.
But little did Joan know that her attempt to live the life her uncle had always dreamt of would lead to heartbreak and tragedy. On Saturday, November the 16th, 2002, District Nurse Catherine Dawson knocked on Joan Beddison's front door for the 3rd time that day. Catherine was only calling to treat a minor ailment, but became increasingly concerned that her patient's condition was now far more serious, and so she called for assistance. And when PC Keith Graham arrived, The district nurse showed him why she thought Joan had failed to answer the door.
You could see through a bedroom window at the rear of this bungalow. There was a shape on a bed, so obviously there was concern there straight away.
As PC Graham tried to find a way into the bungalow, he made a remarkable discovery.
And it was this stage I tried the patio door and he just slid open. Quite shocked, really. Pulled the curtains back, then stepped inside the house.
After entering the house, PC Graham carried out a brief search of the property before heading over to the bedroom.
The first thing that struck me was there was static playing on a radio. You're hoping that it's just a pillow under the quilt rather than a person. But as soon as I got in there, I could see some feet. At that point, obviously, I realised that I was going to stumble across a body.
What PC Graham had discovered was the dead body of Joan Beddison.
She looked like she'd been dead a while as well.
But how had Joan died? Were natural causes to blame, or could Joan have been the victim of an altogether more sinister scheme? On Saturday, the 16th of November 2002, the body of 71-year-old spinster Joan Beddison was found by police officers at her home in Macclesfield, Cheshire. There was no obvious cause of death, but the police officer who'd found her was already suspicious. The patio doors were unlocked, and the positioning of Joan's body seemed peculiar.
The fact that the quilt was pulled completely over the top of her, which it just made you think that somebody had actually pulled it that way.
And upon closer inspection, PC Graham had other concerns.
She was cuddling a pillow, and half of that corner of the pillow seemed to be lodged into her mouth. My first instinct was this is not right at all.
Suspecting foul play, PC Graham requested CID officers to attend the scene.
We looked through the house to see if there was anything overtly obvious in respect of a burglary, a struggle, blood, anything at all.
There wasn't any obvious signs of somebody searching the property or any disruption at the property. And I was directed to the rear back bedroom where Joan was lying on the bed.
And once they could see Joan Beddison for themselves, the detectives had to decide how to proceed.
There are two options here. There's the option that she died of a natural cause. The other options are that there are inconsistencies at the scene. There are things that are troubling not just myself but the other officers at the scene, and that this is a suspicious death. We made the decision that we would have to treat it in that way. We forensically recovered Joan's body, we photographed everything in situ, and we sealed the scene.
The officers were then faced with having to tell Joan's only living relatives the news of her death.
We didn't know what she died from. She was fine when we spoke to her a couple of days ago, but we didn't know. We didn't know what she died from.
After identifying the body, Alf and Sue wanted to make sure Joan's house was secure. But when they arrived in the quaint suburban cul-de-sac, they were greeted with some surprising news from Joan's neighbour, Mrs. Greenwood.
The first thing that she said to my father when we sat down was, "Oh, thank God you've got the money back." And my father and I looked at each other and we said, What do you mean? And she said, you know, that money that Joan had lent that man, she told us you've got it all back.
I just didn't know what they were talking about, and I didn't want to show my ignorance in front of him because I was now getting bad thoughts.
I said to my dad, this isn't right. I said, something just doesn't ring right.
I said, I think we need to report what we've just been told. I said, it sounds like there's a possibility fraud has been committed.
But the police were one step ahead of the family, and they too had already spoken to the Greenwoods.
They highlighted to us a man that they knew as Crittenden, that had visited the property regularly, and that they'd become concerned about Joan because Mr. Greenwood had seen an IOU, as he described it, for hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Upon hearing of the neighbours' concerns, the detectives started to wonder if their inquiry into an unexplained death had uncovered another crime altogether.
Subsequently, we went back to the scene to recover contact details for Mr. Crittenden.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
The officers returned to the house and started to search the bungalow.
I found a metal oblong box which was in the bottom of a wardrobe. And that box contained many documents concerning Joan's financial affairs.
But there was one document in particular that stood out to Detective Constable Puchalski.
What I found that it contained was a loan agreement between Joan Bettison and Peter Crittenden, her financial advisor. And the loan was for £270,000, and the rate of interest on the loan was 10% per annum. That appears to be signed by them both at the bottom.
But this wasn't the only significant document to be found in the house.
We found near to the telephone, just underneath, a handwritten note, which caused us great concern.
Peter, I want to say something to you. I won't be seeing you anymore because it's upsetting me, being deceitful and having to tell lies. I love you so very much, and it's best if it ends now, while we are still the best of friends.
And the final part of the note was that she was asking for her money back. Quite clearly, that note that we found indicated that this was much more than a professional relationship with a financial advisor.
At this point, the police were obviously giving us glimmers of information. For instance, they would say, did we know that this had been Joan's boyfriend? And we said, well, no. I'm sure she would have told us if there was a boyfriend.
And the family were left even more confused when the following day the post-mortem into how Joan died threw up more questions.
We had a call from the police to say that they were not satisfied with the post-mortem. So that then started to ring alarm bells.
We quite clearly now had to be very careful on what steps that we took next. More and more, we had to consider the fact that this was a suspicious death.
Whilst making inquiries into the unexplained death of Joan Beddison, detectives had become concerned with reports of unusual financial arrangements made in collaboration with her financial advisor and apparent lover, Peter Crittenden.
We needed to look at their relationship. He could be the last person that saw Joan alive. So we clearly needed to speak to him and clarify these issues.
But before the detectives could contact Peter, he presented himself to the police.
We're down to first impressions. Very smartly dressed, sun-tanned, athletic-looking, very well-spoken, very well presented, very believable.
Peter Crittenden explained that he was a financial advisor specialising in retirement and as a result earned approximately £70,000 a year based solely on commission. And whilst he admitted to being in a relationship with Joan, he was also happy to tell the police about his wife and their family.
He did inform us that he was a married man living in Worcester with grown-up children. But I'm the police, I'm not the moral police, so I'm not going to make any judgments on that.
Peter then went on to explain how he had met Joan back in October 2000.
The story that he told to me was that Joan responded to an advert in the Times, and as a result, he'd had a standard meeting, as he described it, which did a financial appraisal of Joan's current position. The notes that he'd made from that meeting showed that Joan Bettison had a wealth of almost £500,000.
But it was the third time they met in February 2001 that their relationship started to get more serious.
This is his version of events, that on that meeting they become romantically involved. They agree an action plan as to what she's going to do. And this is breathtaking for me, is that the action plan involved her selling her house that she'd bought because of Norman's dream to retire to Macclesfield, sell all her investments, to invest in property, to invest in business ventures, and to make a new will. And he'd bullet pointed it on the file, that this is what she'd agreed to do.
As part of Peter's 8-point action plan, Joan needed to sell her bungalow, and the following day the couple visited a local estate agent to arrange a valuation.
He somehow has a homemade will kit with him on this visit, and they asked 2 unknowing members of staff to sign this will.
And it was the name of the beneficiary of the will that shocked the police.
This will changes everything that we know about Joan. She's giving everything to this one man that she's met 3 times, Peter John Crittenden.
But Peter was able to explain why Joan had agreed to such a dramatic restructure of her finances in such a short space of time.
He wanted to emphasise that Joan saw this money as a burden to her, and that she wanted to have a bonfire in the back garden. And he sort of said, well, don't do that. We can do something better with your money than burn it in the back garden.
Peter's revelations had amazed the investigating officers and left Joan Beddison's family stunned.
This was so alien to Joan because from a frugal lifestyle of counting pennies and knowing exactly where her money was, suddenly to have got rid of it all, it was not right. We were absolutely in the dark. We thought we knew Joan.
Within 3 months of meeting the elderly spinster, Peter Crittenden had taken full control of Joan's financial affairs and had begun selling off all of her stocks and shares.
By May of that year, the money had gone. It had been transferred in 2 large sums of $125,000, and that money had gone to Mr. Crittenden.
But it soon became clear to the police officers that Peter's investments were unlikely to yield any return at all.
We found out that large amounts of money, of Joan's money, was used to pay off his personal debts. In fact, I understand that within a month of receiving the money, Peter Crittenden paid off nearly £46,000 in credit card debt.
The detectives discovered that Peter had also used Joan Beddison's money to invest in high-risk property deals and betting syndicates, as well as for purchasing a holiday to Venice and a caravan.
Although the loan agreement said 10% per annum interest, there was no information or there was no documentation to show that this 10% was coming Joan's way. Everything had been sold and channeled to Mr. Crittenden.
Meanwhile, the matter of how Joan had died was still in question, and so a second post-mortem was carried out.
The information that we were getting was that it was not absolutely conclusive at that time, but that we were looking towards asphyxia. So again, we're not at a stage where we can conclusively say what's happened here, but another further element is put into the pot.
With no cause of death confirmed, it became clear to the detectives that even after Joan had handed him £250,000, Crittenden was still putting pressure on her to sell her bungalow. But in November 2001, Joan was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and turned to her friends from the church.
We knew about Joan's illness at church. There were people there that had been in the same boat. They'd had big operations, and you know, we all sort of rallied round, and I think they were all amazed how well she came through the operation.
And after leaving hospital, Joan went to stay at Dorothy's to convalesce.
When Joan had been staying with us for about a fortnight, she said, "I've done a silly thing. I'd like to tell you about it."
Joan went on to tell Dorothy all about how she had given her money away to her financial advisor.
She seemed a bit angry, really, that the money had gone and she didn't know where it had gone to. When I heard this, I said, well, really, you should go to the police if you're not happy with it. And she said, oh, no, I don't want to be involved with the police and police cars at the door.
Although Joan didn't want the police involved, she did take Dorothy's advice and decided to write a new will.
Within weeks of recovering, she'd made an appointment to see a solicitor, a local solicitor, and she'd gone about formally making a will and making sure that her family were the executors and the beneficiaries of her will, which is the Beddison family. On the first time we searched the property, I found that will, and it quite clearly stated Joan's intentions, and I think it's the closest thing we've got to Joan's intentions prior to her death. Unfortunately, because of an error in the will, a technical error, she'd never signed it.
However, even if Joan had signed the will, she would never have known that her desire to try and recoup her money would lead to tragedy.
The police asked me, did I want them to officially investigate the possibility of fraud? And I said, certainly.
And on Saturday, the 28th of March 2003, 4 months after the death of Joan Beddison, Peter Crittenden was arrested for theft. But there were some questions that remained unanswered.
It is a massive leap. The fact that he's acted in an irregular manner or may even have stolen Joan's money doesn't mean that he's a murderer.
However, while sifting through Crittenden's personal files, Peter Puchalski made a discovery that would become a major turning point in the investigation.
The phone rang and it was Peter over at Macclesfield looking at the documents. And he just said, "You're not going to believe what I found."
Following the discovery of Joan Beddison's body in November 2001, police officers in Macclesfield, Cheshire, continued to investigate what had caused the 71-year-old spinster's death. Detectives had already uncovered a series of irregular financial dealings that suggested Joan had been the victim of fraudulent behaviour by her financial advisor and lover, Peter Crittenden. After a 4-month investigation, the detectives from Cheshire Constabulary were in a position to arrest Peter Crittenden for theft. But could the 62-year-old also be responsible for the death of his client?
He admitted that the money had gone to pay off certain things or loans to certain people or invested in a franchise which was completely unsuccessful or invested in property which was not as he expected to be. And that's where his first difficulty arose. And now it was becoming difficult because he'd already spent the money. So at that stage, he had to start to describe it in different terms. He would describe this sum of money as a loan as an answer to one question. But then when it became apparent that that wouldn't suffice, he'd describe it as a gift. And when that became apparent that that wouldn't suffice, he'd describe it as a joint investment. And he was very adept at adapting his answers to the questioning.
Detective Sergeant Thomas and Detective Constable Puchalski continued to interview Crittenden, and during a break, the officers decided to search Peter's personal effects and found a document that would prove vital to their investigation.
I notice a decreasing term life insurance policy for Joan Beddison. The grantee was Peter John Crittenden, and the sum assured was £100,000. And this insurance policy was taken out around the time when Joan Beddison fell ill and suffered with cancer. And Peter Crittenden, most importantly, was paying the premiums on this.
Usually taken out to cover mortgage repayments, the life insurance policy cost Crittenden £68 per month to maintain.
This insurance policy decreases after year one from £100,000 to something like £85,000. And that assurance policy was due to decrease down to the lower level of £85,000 in January 2003, which is just 2 months after Joan's death.
This particular document clearly revealed that Crittenden would substantially gain from the death of Joan Beddison if she was to die sooner rather than later.
This was indicating that Peter Crittenden needed to act in some way before he lost everything, before he lost the whole estate, before he lost £100,000 on the assurance policy. I went cold because I thought it was a catalyst to show that we weren't dealing with just a thief here, we were dealing with a murderer. The motive is just overwhelming, really.
I was in the CID room upstairs at Wilmslow, and the phone rang, and it was Peter over at Macclesfield looking at the documents. And he just said, "You're not going to believe what I found." It felt a significant moment, and we both said to each other on the phone, we can't carry on just looking at the theft. This man now has to be a suspect in the death of Joan Beddison.
But the possibility that Crittenden might not only be a thief but also a murderer meant that officers were unable to continue with their questioning.
There is legally a point there at which I have to stop. I can't ignore that fact, and I can't continue with the interviews as he's arrested for theft, and those interviews have to stop, and we have to reconsider what we've got and deal with the matter in a different way.
The detectives had no choice other than to release Peter Crittenden whilst they re-evaluated the case.
I think that's the only time I've seen him surprised. Faced with the facts that they'd had so far, is he'd given a version of events and he's bailed. Obviously his legal team and him were totally unaware of what's going on in the background.
But not everyone was happy upon hearing the news of his release.
I felt very vulnerable. There was really only my brother, Dad and I, and I was quite frightened.
And Sue knew she was right to feel frightened when detectives revealed they had uncovered enough evidence to launch a full-scale murder inquiry.
I remember coming to Macclesfield, and myself and Pete were sat in front of a full room of detectives and forensic experts, all listening to what we had to say, all believing in what we were saying, and all ready to follow up the inquiries and the actions that were being generated.
The police started to re-examine every aspect of the case, starting with the crime scene.
Part of the initial stages of the murder investigation was to forensically re-examine the scene. Was there anything that we'd missed, and to take it apart in terms of an evidential scene.
The crime scene investigators re-examined the house, which had remained sealed off since Joan's body was discovered 6 months earlier.
One of the crime scene investigators carefully looked at all the bedding, not only at Joan Beddison's bedding, but at the bedding in the guest room. This bedroom looked perfectly neat and tidy, and there was a flowery pink pattern on the pillows, but he managed to notice some blood on that pillow. And we sent that pillow and the pillow that was found near to Joan Beddison's face off to the lab to do a thorough forensic examination to give us an interpretation on the blood splattering on both pillows.
After extensive analysis of both pillows, the Forensic Science Service was able to make a major breakthrough in the investigation.
Their findings were that the pillow in the guest bedroom had been used to overlay on top of the other pillow near to Joan's mouth, and that she had been smothered, and that her last gasp had caused a spray of blood. And this spray had sprayed over both pillows.
This revelation also backed up the results of the second post-mortem, which had suggested that Joan might have been suffocated. However, The scientists also came to another important conclusion.
Joan must have been murdered, because if Joan had died in that bed, who put the pillow back onto the bed in the other room? The room that Peter Crittenden always slept in when he stayed over.
With asphyxia now looking almost certain to be the cause of death, the detectives decided to carry out a third and final post-mortem.
At this point, it had been suggested to us that she had been suffocated with a pillow, and that the pillow had been pushed against her face, against her lips and her nose, and they were looking at this post-mortem with a view to checking for bruising deep down in the tissues.
The pathologist performed a microscopic examination of the tissue beneath the surface of the skin.
What he found was that there was bruising which would indicate that pressure had been brought to bear around the lip and nose area.
This new information, together with the results of the previous post-mortems and the forensic reports, proved that Joan had been suffocated, and at last the family was starting to get their questions answered.
In one respect, we felt pleased that we were getting to the bottom of things, getting to know what the cause of death was, but also it was a horrific cause of death.
I was relieved that at last the police had something definitely to work upon, that I hadn't wasted their time, but the shock of it, the horror, that it could happen to a lovely person, a quiet, shy person like Joan, beggars belief.
Meanwhile, as police officers continued to trawl through the mountains of documents seized from Crittenden's office, they came across another client whose circumstances were nearly identical to those of Joan's.
We had identified an elderly lady who was a client of Peter's 12 years ago.
Crittenden's documents revealed that the client had given him over £130,000 to invest, and like Joan, she hadn't received any return on her money.
They were both females in their 60s, they were both on their own, they both had large amounts of cash to invest, and they were both, you could say, vulnerable.
It appears from her client file that he gave her similar investment advice and similar bullet points. Sell your home, move near to me in Worcester.
But unlike Joan, the client did follow Crittenden's suggestion and moved house.
Remember back to that checklist that he has. She moves from Wales to where Peter Crittenden lives, exactly like he'd written with Joan about their agreed action plan. The similarities were too striking to ignore. The key issues were there.
Although the discovery of this new prosecution witness reinforced the possibility that Crittenden might have deceived Joan to steal her money, the police needed more evidence to implicate their prime suspect in her murder. 30 police officers, together with experts in forensics and pathology, continued to examine every minute detail of evidence and started to see discrepancies in Peter Crittenden's alibi.
He said that he had been up to visit Joan on the Tuesday before she was found on the Saturday. They'd been out that night for a meal at the Bridge Hotel in Prestbury, which is a very nice restaurant. They returned home and they'd stayed in the double bedroom, and that he'd had breakfast with her the next morning and then left to go back to Worcester. He said his last contact with Joan was obviously when he'd left her that day.
However, when Crittenden's telephone records were scrutinised, the detectives noticed something suspicious that might identify when Joan was murdered.
We discovered that late on Thursday evening, sometime after 9 o'clock, Peter Crittenden's mobile rang Joan Bettison for 3 minutes.
He'd not previously mentioned this, and we were confused with that. It was a 3.5-minute conversation. So he'd obviously made contact that night with Joan Bettison.
Now, we know from inquiries with neighbours that the curtains had been left drawn on the Friday, but it wasn't until the Saturday that nurses actually visited the house. So that left us with a possibility that something had occurred on the Thursday night into Friday morning.
And when the investigating team cross-referenced this information with Crittenden's bank records, they made another startling discovery.
One of the documents we recovered from himself, which was confirmed by his credit card transactions, was that he had made a purchase of petrol in the early hours, just after midnight, of Friday the 15th of November 2002 at Blackpool service station.
Crittenden told police he was in bed with his wife in Worcester on the night Joan was murdered, but with his alibi now in question, the police needed to trace his movements once he left the petrol station.
One of the officers involved in the case knew of a highways agency system of cameras that cover the M5 and M6 area. And we found that 10 minutes after filling up with petrol, Peter Crittenden's number plate is registered on an ANPR camera on the M5 travelling north.
And 4 hours later, Crittenden's car was registered again 150 miles away.
The car is recorded in the Staffordshire area on the M6 travelling south.
This new information directly contradicted Crittenden's alibi and gave police evidence that he had instead driven 400 miles to Joan's home in Macclesfield and back. After a 7-month investigation, the team felt they were finally in a position to present their case to their prime suspect, Peter John Crittenden.
All those bits of evidence had come to light over a period of time. It's easy to summarise them quickly, but that had taken extensive investigation to recover all those bits of investigation. They didn't just fall into our laps.
And on June the 6th, 2003, Peter Crittenden was arrested for a second time. But would he admit to the murder of 71-year-old spinster Joan Beddeson?
I was not surprised at all when the police said that they suspected that not only had fraud been committed, but that a more serious crime had been committed. And obviously the more serious crime could only be one thing, and that was the murder of Joan Bettison.
Following an investigation into the brutal murder of Joan Beddison, police officers had arrested her financial advisor and lover, Peter Crittenden. The detectives started to question their prime suspect by revealing the evidence they had collected during their 7-month investigation. And they started by asking Crittenden about the phone call he made to Joan on the night of her murder.
His explanation was he couldn't remember that conversation, he couldn't remember that phone call. And what we were saying was that if this is somebody that you loved, somebody that you're about to inherit all their wealth, you're about to be the executor of their will, and you can't remember the last conversation that you had with this person.
The officers then presented the suspect with evidence that directly contradicted his alibis.
He's supposed to be at home in bed with his wife, but we could prove that he'd made a purchase of fuel at just after midnight from Blackpool service station, which is just off the M5. Key piece of information. Do you remember that? Where were you going? So, of course, he's now been caught out. So his explanation was then that, yes, he did pop out to fill his vehicle up, but then he'd returned home and gone to bed.
However, it was the information collected from the highways agency that caught Crittenden off guard.
So he's supposed to be heading back towards home, but we can place his vehicle, his registration, going the other way, travelling up the M5 motorway north within a few minutes of just purchasing fuel. And I remember when we revealed that evidence to him, that was the first time I ever saw emotion with him. It quite clearly disturbed him. That was something that he had not anticipated whatsoever and fell outside of his comfort zone. And I remember when we came back into the room once he'd had an opportunity to digest the information that we'd given to him, and you could clearly tell that he was distressed and that he looked as if he'd been crying. He knew that we'd got evidence that was going to convict him of murder.
Despite the display of emotion, Crittenden astonishingly refused to admit he had driven his car that night. But he hadn't reported his car stolen and was unable to give any other explanation as to how it had twice been recorded travelling on the motorway on the night Joan was murdered.
He always has denied that he was the driver of that vehicle and that he wasn't on the motorway that night. He says that after filling up with fuel, he returned to his home address, which quite clearly wasn't the case.
Faced with such overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the police believed they finally had enough proof to prosecute Peter Crittenden.
And so he was then charged with the murder of Joan Bettison.
In addition to murder, Peter Crittenden was also charged with theft. For Joan's family, there was a great sense of relief.
I felt elated. For myself, my family, and for the police. Because I knew that it had been one of the most difficult cases.
I kind of felt a sense of, at last something's happened. Obviously I went straight up to my father's, told him, and by then I think it had sunk in a little bit more that yes, that there is this man out there that they strongly suspect is guilty.
And on Tuesday, May the 11th, 2004, 18 months after Joan's death, the case came to trial at Chester Crown Court, where the accused pleaded not guilty.
The first time that I saw Peter Crittenden, I could see what Joan had seen in him. She went for jackets, ties, presentable, and that was what he was.
But Crittenden soon made his presence felt.
He was quite patronising to the jury. He was pointing at them. He tried to belittle people. And once or twice he lost his temper, which obviously then showed another side to him.
Not once in that box did that man show any remorse for the dreadful deed that he'd carried out.
Crittenden continued to dismiss the evidence, but detectives now believe they knew exactly how Joan had met her death and presented the jury with their interpretation of the events leading up to the murder.
I believe that Peter came on the Tuesday and met Joan and went out for a meal with her and stayed the night. But his plan had been hatched. He had unlocked the patio door so he could gain access into the house, and then he returned home. And I believe he made a final phone call on the Thursday night to make sure that Joan would be there, fill the car up with petrol and travel down in the early hours of the Friday morning, crept through the rear door, went to the guest bedroom and got the pillow. I believe he's wandered in and then smothered her with both pillows. Peter Crittenden, although he's 64, he keeps fit in the gym, and he was far too strong for Joan Beddison. She was in her 70s and she was no match to fight Peter Crittenden off.
And having achieved his objective, the police believed Crittenden then returned home and got back into bed with his wife. However, when interviewed, she claimed that she was asleep and could neither confirm nor deny his alibi. The case was debated for over 7 weeks, and eventually the jury was sent to deliberate. And after another 2 days, they returned with their verdict.
We were just so nervous because we just didn't know what was going to happen. The spokesman stood up and they said guilty, and we were just, I don't know, we were drained. We're absolutely drained, but relieved.
On Thursday, the 1st of July 2004, Peter Crittenden was given a life sentence for the murder of Joan Beddison, the 71-year-old spinster who entrusted him with her most precious possessions, her money and her love. Although he continues to maintain his innocence, detectives were able to uncover substantial evidence that proved that Peter John Crittenden had the motive and opportunity to both steal from and then murder his client and lover, Joan Beddison.
Mr. Crittenden is a totally and utterly convincing character. He groomed Joan. He knew what buttons to press, and he convinced her to do things that I think fundamentally she knew were wrong. But in Joan's defence, anybody would be convinced by Mr. Crittenden.
One good thing has come out of this dreadful period, and that is that this man has been taken off the streets, and no longer can he take money off gullible, lonely people.
I think Joan initially loved Peter. I'm sure she was taken in by him. I don't think he loved her. How can he have loved her? He murdered her.